Hi guys, how you doing? I'm guessing I'm finding you either sitting in your room or sitting on the sofa, feeling pretty bored right now. You're either fed up perhaps of playing on the computer, you're had enough of strumming on the guitar, you're fed up of banging the drum, you've read every book on the bookshelf and you've used up your month's data allowance chatting with your friends, and you can't believe that you're thinking it, but you really wish that you were back in school. Is that a yes? A no? Well, it's weird, isn't it, to think that the whole world is going through this strange experience as we face this coronavirus. And of course it's very different for other people in many different ways, depending on where you live and depending on your own family's circumstances. But just think of it, that when you are old and grey, you will be able to tell your grandkids that you are part of the famous coronavirus lockdown of 2020. And hopefully it will only be 2020. It's an event that has changed the world already, even though we're not at the end of it, and even though we don't know exactly what things will be different when we get to the end. It's been a world-changing situation. And there have been many, of course, world-changing events in history, but nothing quite like this. Even World War II, which was probably the most global, had the most global significance, this is just different and it's strange. There have been many events in history which have taken place like pandemics before. You think 100 years ago of the Spanish flu, and then several hundred years ago of the Black Plague or the bubonic plague, which killed hundreds of millions of people and truly did change the world. It seems that when people are measuring events that have changed the world, that various revolutions make it onto the list. Think of the Industrial Revolution, the Medical Revolution, even the French Revolution seems to be right near the top of world-changing events. The most recent world-changing event was probably 9/11, I guess, in 2001. But even you, probably too young to remember that because you weren't even born, I guess, in 2001. Well, events that have changed millions of lives and spread around to affect millions of other people's lives as history goes on. But there is one event in history that was just about one man. It didn't involve millions of people, it involved just one man. And yet from that event, the eyewitnesses who saw it and believed it, it's gone on to change millions and billions of people's lives throughout history. And in a sense, it's an event in history that has the potential to change every situation, every person's life who's ever been on the planet. And you know what I'm talking about, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. This one event in one day, 2,000 years ago, and yet everyone's life can be changed by it. So if it's true, your life can be changed, but not only your life now, but eternal life can be changed. If you don't believe it, then tragically still your life will be changed as a result of not believing in the resurrection. So whether we believe it or not, we better make sure that we find out whether it's true, to investigate it, to see if it's right, is worth giving some time and some thought to find out if it's right. So what does the Bible say? What does the Bible tell us, claim about the resurrection? That is, the rising from the dead of this man, Jesus Christ. Well, here's a nice summary of what the Bible teaches. Jesus of Nazareth, a Jewish prophet who claimed to be the Christ, prophesied in the Jewish scriptures, was arrested, was judged a political criminal, and was crucified. 3 days after his death and burial, some women who went to his tomb found the body gone. In subsequent weeks, his disciples claimed that God had raised him from the dead and that he appeared to them various times before ascending into heaven. From that foundation, Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire and has continued to exert great influence down through the centuries. So, if millions of people have believed in this and have done for 20 centuries, is there evidence that this event took place? Or are people just deluded? Are people believing blindly without any evidence? Well, a man called Josh McDowell, who was an unbeliever, who sought out to disprove the resurrection, wrote a book called Evidence That Demands a Verdict. He tried to debunk Christianity, but he ended up becoming a Christian. And when asked by a university student why he couldn't refute Christianity, he says this: "For this simple reason, I am unable to explain away the event in history, that is, the resurrection of Jesus Christ." Now, there are several pieces of evidence that we can put together to prove the resurrection happened. And there's been many arguments put forward against the resurrection. And we're going to think about those as we go through these videos. There'll be a number of videos probably, just so each video is not too long. So they're all going to begin with the letter E. So the first thing we'll look at in this video will be the execution itself, the fact that Jesus actually died. That'll be the first thing we look at. We're going to look at evidence for the empty tomb. We'll look at the eyewitness accounts. We'll look at early records in and outside of the Bible. And we'll look at the emergence of the church and the fact that that is great evidence that this event really did happen and wasn't made up. So first thing we're going to look at is going to be the execution of Jesus. And just to say that of course most of the evidence that we're going to look at is going to be from the Bible. But actually, as one professor of university said, that if the New Testament were a collection of secular writings, their authenticity would generally be regarded as beyond all doubt. So really, if people have any kind of prejudice against this religious book that will hinder them listening to the evidence, they need to put that aside, because there's vast amounts of evidence that will show us that we can rely and trust the Bible. But maybe we can do that in another video. So first up is the execution. But arguments against the resurrection are firstly that Jesus, well, he didn't actually die. So surely if Jesus was alive and well 3 days after he died, then maybe he didn't actually die. Someone else died in his place, like a body double kind of thing. But when you read the four narratives of the Gospels, as they describe the crucifixion event, it will be impossible for it to be someone else other than Jesus to die. Why? Well, because people who knew him were with him and saw him throughout the whole thing. So right from when he was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, to him being in custody, being on trial before the high priest, to him being before King Herod, before Pontius Pilate, then in the custody of the Roman soldiers as they beat him, and then as they nailed him to the cross in the public. None of this happened behind closed doors. The religious leaders were there accusing him, the Jewish crowd were shouting, the Jesus followers were even following behind him, and they were stood there with the cross. And of course, Jesus' own mother witnessed the crucifixion of her son. Surely she would recognize and know that it is him. And even the fact that Jesus spoke to his mum is evidence that it really was him who was crucified. If you look in John's Gospel, chapter 19, verse 26, Jesus speaks to Mary, his mum, and he says, well, it says this: "When Jesus saw his mother there," that's by the cross, "and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to her, 'Woman, here is your son,' and to the disciple, 'Here is your mother.'" From that time on, this disciple, which is John writing this book, took her into his home. Okay, so another argument put forward to the fact that Jesus didn't really die is that maybe he survived the crucifixion. So he was nailed to the cross, but actually he survived. This theory is called the swoon theory. And the idea is that Jesus suffered and appeared to be dead, was put in the tomb, but after some time of rest, after the cool environment, after maybe the smell of the tomb, he revived. And Jesus pushed back the stone and walked away. But there are several problems with this theory, Because, first of all, the Roman soldiers were expert killers. They were professional executioners. Okay, and people did not survive a Roman crucifixion. And if they had, then the Roman soldiers would have been in a lot of trouble themselves. Think, first of all, of the severity of the crucifixion. Okay, the flogging they would have had to have gone through at first. Jesus was flogged, the Bible tells us. It's brutal. Skin being beaten and bruised, ripped, with the flesh being ripped because of the whip that was being used. Incredible loss of blood. This is even before they are crucified. He would have become physically weak, psychologically stressed because of this event. Jesus was too weak to even carry his cross. Remember, Matthew, Mark, Luke tell us that Simon of Cyrene carried his cross because Jesus was far too weak. Now, the actual crucifixion was one of the most cruel forms of death, of executions ever invented. And it's just horrific to think of how someone actually died in the end, that is, of suffocation, as they weren't able to keep themselves up on the cross before they died. Now, in John's account of the crucifixion, we read that the Jews being concerned that they didn't want bodies hanging on the cross over the special Sabbath, and so they wanted the bodies taken down. And so if they were still alive, the soldiers were asked to go and kill them, finish them off. So in John chapter 19 verse 31, the religious leaders, they asked Pilate to have the legs broken and the bodies taken down. Then we read in verse 33, but when they came to Jesus and found that he had already died, they didn't break his legs. You see, Jesus was already dead. And to make sure of it, verse 34 tells us, instead, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. The man who saw it has given testimony, and his testimony is true. Now, Jesus would have had a spear driven right through his rib cage, through his lungs, into his heart. Yet this wasn't a little stab in the side to see if he responded. This would have been a killer blow if Jesus had, in fact, been still alive. So, Jesus died. He was buried in the tomb. However, the Bible claims, doesn't it, that 3 days later, Jesus came back from life. The tomb was empty. How do you explain an empty tomb? Well, that will be the topic of the next video. So please stay tuned and keep thinking about these issues.